This is your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a comics podcast. This is the show for people who know President Loki was an improvement over Trump. President Loki could import all of the better points of the Norse public policies. He'd be our first chaotic neutral president, which is an improvement over the usual neutral evil. And we'd get Medicare for all and free snakes. Joining me today is writer, comics writer, TV writer, Daniel Kibblesmith. He is an Emmy-Nominated writer for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and the writer of comics like Marvel's Loki 2019, Black Panther vs. Deadpool 2018, and others for Marvel and DC. He is also the author of the picture books like Santa's Husband and the upcoming Princess Dinosaur, and co-author of the humor book How to Win at Everything. He was one of the founding editors of ClickHole, and his humor writing can be seen in places like the New Yorker, McSweeney's, APM's Marketplace. He works and lives in New York with his favorite author, Jennifer Wright. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Hey, thank you for having me. I also like the way that you say Princess Dinosaur, like you're like the movie phone, like it's not even out yet and you're already giving it a boost.
Well, as I read that, that's actually one of the things that my cat is named.
Excuse me?
Well, my cat's name is Dinosaur, and but I've decided that your book is about my cat, so thank you for writing it.
Yeah, as the author, I'm allowed to make that canon. I think spiritually, it's probably about a lot of people's cats.
Is it a children's book, illustrated?
It is. It's the same illustrator as Santa's Husband, my friend A.P. Quach, and what it's actually about is a dinosaur who is a princess. She's, maybe around 3 years old. And it's a book for toddlers, about toddlers, how, you don't have to be any one thing. We kind of came up with it because we noticed a lot of parents were trying to steer their little girls away from the fairy princess stuff, but they get obsessed with fairy princesses, just regardless.
Yeah.
Like, they'd go to a friend's house or they'd see a commercial or something, go to a themed birthday party. So I think that it puts a lot of pressure on parents to kind of combat gender stereotypes from a young age or act like, it's necessarily inherently good or inherently bad to fall into those roles. And the way we saw it was that little girls can be princesses and dinosaurs and kind of oscillate wildly moment to moment. And anybody, who has a toddler or who has been a toddler maybe remembers the swath of destruction that you cut through everything, even if you're wearing a fairy princess costume at the time.
Yes.
So, we wanted to make something that kind of synthesized like the reality of being and raising a little kid, and maybe make parents worry a little less about their dinosaurs turning into fairy princesses and vice versa.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, people contain multitudes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're going for.
Yeah, I feel like I was definitely part of the earlier generation where like people didn't think you could rectify those multiple identities. I never was bit by the princess bug at all anyway, but I think it was pretty clear that if I had been, I would have been like serious source of trauma. So, and yeah, I think it's great, especially to encourage them to be able to explore all those different sides of themselves, especially for boys as well. So
yeah, it's for all kids, but it was certainly partially inspired by when I worked at a library, and the parents would come in, really well-meaning people with their kids, and they'd say, "Hey, Abby, do you want the book about dump trucks? Or do you want the book about ninjas?" And she'd be like, no, I want the one with Tinkerbell on it. And, they'd say things like, everything's princesses right now. We're going through a princess phase. It's really interesting to have so much of the existing sort of gender stereotype being that, the parents wanted their little girls to be delicate fairy princesses. And then in recent generations, there was this confrontation of that where it said, okay, we're going to try to have, gender-neutral toys like science and Legos and things. And the fairy princess stuff still just happens. So,
well, I mean, I think we're in a sort of specific cultural space, you and I, like as New Yorkers, as people from sort of particular political orientation, where that is really true. But I definitely, when you step outside of a lot of the spaces that we might be in, it's still kind of 1950 out there in a lot of places.
Yes, that is certainly true. So hopefully this works for everybody. Hopefully this works both ways, because it's just kind of like, the book's not aspirational. It's just dealing with the reality of like how kids see themselves when they play.
So when is that going to be out in 2020?
Fall of 2020. I don't think we have an exact release date yet.
Got it.
Visit your local bookstores frequently for all kinds of reasons.
So how did you? You were doing some of these illustrated children's books before you were working on comics, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, or kind of concurrently, I guess. I don't know. I do a lot of stuff. I kind of put stuff out there and see what people will say yes to and actually let me write. But yeah, Santa's Husband, which you can tell from the title, has sort of a similarly mission-oriented young person book, came out in October of 2017. So I think by then I'd already done a few comics. I'd been doing things for Valiant for a couple of years at that point.
You had the Valiant High series. I heard great things about it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the things I'm proudest of. It's a little hard to get people to check it out sometimes because it's an alternate universe high school story, which people love. But for Valiant, which some of the people don't know the characters as well. So we tried really hard to make it work as an introduction to the Valiant universe as much as a riff on the Valiant universe, so that ideally you could pick up Valiant High and then move on to other Valiant books, or you could be a Valiant reader and then pick up Valiant High and say, like, oh, it's so funny that they made Bloodshot the gym coach, because he's sort of the Punisher, Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator type.
That's great. That makes sense. That's basically, it's a high school AU comic.
Yeah, it's exactly that.
It's kind of amazing. I mean, Marvel has that as a video game, right? It's got that Avengers Academy video game, or I don't even know if you call it a video game anymore. I'm so bad at game stuff. Sure. Is that what they call them?
Mobile experience.
A mobile experience. Well, I think that there's such a big appetite that fans have for seeing the characters they love in these other contexts.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the biggest influences on Valiant High was... I'd say the two biggest influences on Valiant High are both from Marvel World, which is X-Men Evolution, of course, which would have been the big canonized high school AU thing when I was coming up, and 1602 written by Neil Gaiman, and even though that one is a wildly different setting. It really lays the groundwork for how do you map the archetypes onto each other. Who are the mandatory players for a high school setting? Who are your breakfast club, and who in the other sandbox that you're playing in conforms to those archetypes. So that's the real fun of AU. And I think because I'm not an artist, I imagine if you're an artist, the fun is drawing them and designing the characters. But as from the writing side, figuring out like who clicks like puzzle pieces into, X-Men Evolution was also really good at that. Like figuring out which characters had the sort of inherent authority or gravitas to be teachers versus who was obviously going to be a student. So Kitty Pryde, even though she's grown up now in most of the Marvel stories, she has the legacy of being the teenage character. So obviously she's one of the kids, and Wolverine is 1,000,000 years old. So obviously he's one of the teachers, and it's fun. It's so crackling to get to play that game.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that folks love about the existing comics universes, which is why we're so wedded to them, and sometimes folks can have a harder time breaking out from like Marvel U, Valiant U, DC U, like whatever the U is that you're into, is that we have like these elaborate identifications with different tropes and different kinds of characters for different people. Like I think that if you go up to a fan who's maybe not active in fandom and isn't even aware of the concept of like high school AU as like being a trope, like you could say, okay, if this took place in a high school, who would each person be? And they would immediately have opinions on that. You know?
Yeah, no question.
And high school in particular, because that's an experience that most people have had.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's universal, and the personalities are also really big. And it looms so large in pop culture anyway that I think it's kind of on the tip of our tongues at all times.
Whereas I feel like if you say you're going to do like a Star Trek influenced like AU of Marvel, people might take a second to think about it. But if there's one thing we know is in the Star Trek AU, Loki is obviously Q.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think Q is more powerful than the way I'm writing Loki, because I need a Loki who can really get the crap beaten out of him. But definitely personality-wise, yeah.
So I'm somebody who's read not all of the recent Loki series, but a good chunk of them. I think the first one was I came in reading Kieran Gillen's Journey into Mystery, which his Journey into Mystery run with Loki is just one of the greatest comics of the post 2000 year period, if you ask me. I've really enjoyed Al Ewing's work. Asgard's Assassin is really great. I actually didn't read President Loki, although I meant to. It did look quite good. So you're the newest person picking up the contemporary Loki mantle, and it's so interesting because he's really one of the characters that was super important to the Silver Age. He was the Avengers' first bad guy, like the reason the Avengers came into being, and he's gone through such an evolution, and I feel like increasingly, actually not even almost from the start, it felt like of the journey of the character into being increasingly one that people would like as a protagonist and like cheer and want like good things to happen to them, was sort of the question of how are we going to reconcile this character's history with, which included doing bad things that made the Avengers team up, with our desire to see them as not just a protagonist but a heroic and charming protagonist, even if they're not like heroic in the way someone like Spider-Man is heroic in the current series. And it's always interesting for me to see how different writers are grappling with it. And I wasn't sure, like, what was your thought? What were your thoughts about like that coming into this project?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's like a 60-year redemption project. Like you said, there were tremendous runs of Loki as protagonist comics, if not Loki as outright hero comics, leading up to this. And it's incredibly intimidating. It's gigantic shoes to fill. But I think that I mostly just sort of treated him the way that you would treat any protagonist, which is he is a person who thinks he's right. He's good at what he does, and he thinks he's right. And whether you're writing, a book about, Doctor Doom, or Magneto getting revenge for the many, many horrible things that have been done to Magneto, you, I think, naturally just sort of put yourself in their shoes. So with Loki, it was really fun because he's, you called him chaotic neutral earlier. So he's a chaotic neutral person who has gained this kind of self-awareness about how to help the world, but it doesn't come naturally to him. But he is being rewarded for doing it. So you have this kind of person who really wants to be good for various and shifting reasons. And I think that's enough. I mean, that's enough to drive a story. You have somebody who has the goal of wanting to keep a good thing going, and the ever-looming fear of it not working out because he is afraid of his own nature or aware of his own nature. And I think that's something that everybody can relate to. And in superhero comics, it's ultimately not that different than, say, Wolverine, who is always trying to be a good guy, but kind of fears that he is an animal who's just going to go berserk and kill everybody. Or Peter Parker, who wants to save everybody, but he's got this voice in the back of his head telling him that he's a screw-up. So it's the version of Loki that we sort of like collectively evolved into is very Marvel Comics. It's a flawed hero who is in the shadow of his perfect golden brother, who is literally king of the universe now. And I think that in a lot of ways it's easier for, as much as I love heroic Thor stories, it's easier for me personally to relate to the guy who everybody thinks is questionable.
Yeah, Thor is so much more interesting as a side character for Loki than he is as his own protagonist. Like, I just think that that's super clear.
I think a lot of Loki readers are agreeing with you. I think that's sort of a little dichotomy is forming. You know, like the Batman people and the Superman people. You know, because everything's so rich. I think if you don't read comic books, you maybe don't realize how much nuance and variation there is in it, because it all just looks like bright colors and punching. But it's like, you know, it's like sports or politics or a Game of Thrones is like maybe a more direct comparison. It's like you have all of these little people with different like levels of status and motivations and things. So the fan favorites, the people that you relate to, it's often for, you know, like you were saying with the alternate universes, it's often for deeply personal reasons.
I think that, like, the beginning of Marvel, most people I think would say the beginning of Marvel really giving Loki a redemption arc dates back to the popularity of the character of Loki after coming out of the first Thor movie, which is like kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, you have this incredibly charismatic, excellent performance from the actor, you know, former stage actor with like, you know, and that's how Kenneth Branagh ended up bringing him into the Marvel universe, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And people forget that. That's like why he was in there.
That's
Kenneth
right,
Branagh was like, esteemed stage actor.
We're gonna do Thor Shakespeare style, and it largely works.
Yeah. And it was very insightful. So, you know, but the character is super popular coming out of the movie, which is just interesting because, like, he is never more evil than he is in Thor 1. He, like, gets compared to a Nazi by a Holocaust survivor. But the fandom is like, I mean, God, I could get banned for life for some of the observations I could make about people's responses to him from the first movie. But
because they're so sexual. Because they can't.
I'm going to get into Yeah, I mean, it's going to be like, I don't want to say like, oh, people wouldn't have had this reaction to the character if he was cast as by someone who was less charismatic and handsome, but like, I think we can acknowledge that that's true. But I think that the beginnings of the reimagining of the character actually date back to the first time, and I didn't look at when that was, but the first time we see Loki in a female form, which we may have forgotten was because he had taken over Sif's body, not because he shapeshifted. It's a lot cooler when you're just like, yeah, like Loki is like fluid and is going to appear femme in this issue. Versus is like, no, he stole Sif's body and is running around on Sif's body.
Yeah, it's regular evil. It's not a cool character progression.
Yeah. But I felt like that was actually a big transformative moment in at least comics readers in terms of like how people thought about the character. I don't know. I mean, when did you start thinking differently about Loki?
I mean, I would agree that was around the time that I think they figured out there's more here. And that's a very modern era, I think, phenomenon is that you start digging a little deeper because of how many stories have been told. But I would say that Loki has always been sympathetic in theory, the same way that Doctor Doom and Magneto had been, if not sympathetic, at least you can recognize their motives. That's like, oh, like Doctor Doom is very prideful and he wants to be the best, and he's in the shadow of this other guy, and he's scarred. And not Wolverine. Magneto has. Is a Holocaust survivor, which comes out kind of more in the modern era. Really fleshes out his character. I think Loki is very like, he looks like an evil old man. He looks like the devil for most of his appearances. So I think that the evolution of Loki sort of coincides with the evolution of comic books, where it's like, well, we're interested in all of the characters. And we're telling a lot of stories about Thor, and we're running out of stories where he just like, Loki does something crafty and Thor figures it out and hits him with a hammer. So I think even like around like the Walt Simonson stuff, you start to see Asgard being this kind of like bigger soap opera. where there's a lot of new characters introduced, and the universe is expanded dramatically, and I think that Loki starts to become another Asgardian in a way that everything kind of just has to drive this big ensemble story forward. And then I think you're right. I think you get into this other era of like the kind of modern, what I think of as modern, like Civil War type comics, where it's like, okay, now the bad guys are going to be the protagonists like half of the time, because we love all of these characters, we're interested in all of these characters. And then people start looking at, with like that little bit of deconstructionist eye of like, okay, so what do we know Loki can do? We know that he's a shapeshifter. What has he never done before? What has he done in mythology that we've never done in comics before? And one of those things is being a woman, like kind of a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So I think it was very logical that eventually you would do that. And if you go back and read, a lot of the 60s Loki, he's doing super weird stuff just because comic books were weird at the time.
Yes.
Kind of everybody was doing weird stuff, but the stuff Loki's doing, you can kind of put it in a box of things that Loki could still theoretically do today, because he's a creature of myth, and he's, on the chaotic neutral side of things.
And like Jack Kirby is brilliant, and therefore is going to make people do weird things because it's fun to draw.
Oh yeah.
So.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny because I don't know. I think like obviously like my number one mythological Loki fact is that Loki is specifically and clearly gender fluid. I think one of the cool things that you've done is, Loki, like, one of the many like things where he has been put down on and therefore has resentments that are relatable resentments that you're like, yeah, no, this is fucked up, is that he was like the small frost giant. So of course it makes sense for him to shift if he's going to live, and if he's going to be, sent off to live with the Asgardians, he's going to like look like them. And it's also easier for him to do that because he's human sized, basically. And you've thought about like, well, if Loki is a human sized frost giant, like, then there's other frost giants who don't fit in too.
You're talking about Durf.
I'm thinking about Durf, the character you invented.
Durf is for people who haven't picked up any of the new Lokis yet, Durf is a frost giant who is like less than half of Loki's size. He's like a little elf monkey. And in our prequel story that came out in War of the Realms Omega, along with some of the other War of the Realms epilogues, Loki arrives in Jotunheim as the new king, and all of the giants are obviously skeptical of this because their culture sort of is stratified by strength and combat and size. And as a result of that, they have this very, 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 very little outcast frost giant named Durf, who Loki obviously takes to. And that's our first story about Loki as king, and what Loki trying to do the right thing looks like. I wanted to have a character that Loki genuinely sympathized with, versus seeing opportunity in being kind to them. And the only person that I think Loki could really purely identify with is a version of himself. So when he gets to Jotunheim, basically on his first official day as king, he meets this tiny little frost giant, and he says, "Oh, I know exactly what this guy is going through," and it awakens a sort of, protective, almost a parental instinct.
I think that's great, because I think you've just described a really understandable way for why Loki would, do something heroic in there, and it is through identification. One of the questions I sort of prepared was thinking about like a lot of charismatic, generally male, but not exclusively, characters in genre, not even just in genre. Like, you always run who had been villains and who are sympathetic. Like, you always sort of run the risk of like losing that which makes people villainous, and like, you know, like what are the things that makes them a challenging character and good and interesting, because it's not just an easy. They're not a marshmallow. They're not, you know, something soft and sweet. Like, they're more complex than that. And versus like how when it goes a little bit too far into the term that we may, like, it's sort of a phantom term, and I realized I didn't really like the TV tropes definition of it too much, but like a woobification, if the term, I don't even know if that's familiar to you.
I'm not familiar. I mean, I'm familiar with this phenomenon, but I'm not familiar with that word.
It is so common. Yeah. It's, you know, so it's sort of like, how do you do a Loki who is, you know, someone who's capable of changing and has been in this, as you said, like a 60-year, you know, redemption project, while still keeping some of those sharp corners that are essential to him being the god of mischief. Never mind, like, Loki in mythology was never the god of evil. That always kind of gave me like a rash. But he was the god of mischief, and that isn't an easy and cuddly thing to be necessarily. So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, I think Loki is a little bit immune to that phenomenon, because I think about stuff that I like Spike on Buffy, right? And this is a big thing in TV shows that go on for a long time, is that the villains kind of get absorbed into the gang.
Yes, because
you like them, the watching at home like them, and then they join the team and they fight bigger villains. And especially in genre, but also just in things like Aaron Sorkin shows. I've noticed they fall in love with their bad guys, and then the bad guys just like get added to the ball of heroes, and the new bad guys show up, and then those people are sympathetic. Which I think also speaks to the way writers and audiences kind of love villains, and the guilty pleasure endorphins of rooting for them. But I think Loki is a little immune to that, because he's not on a leash. He's not a bad guy all the time who is now acting out of character. He's a literally shape-shifting mercurial liar who is doing things for different reasons in different moments. So I think that if we were lucky enough to do 50 issues of Loki being this golden god who was only committing good deeds, and then in the very last issue, he blows up the Earth and says, "Surprise, I'm evil." No one could... You might be disappointed as a reader, I mean, also because that's a completely insane story, but no one could say, well, that's not Loki. That's not how Loki would behave.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways Loki is sort of immune to the defanging, because you don't really know. You don't know if he's really good, if he's doing an impression of somebody who's good, or if he's doing good in the service of himself, or even if it is accidental, which is something that we want to play with in this story, is whether or not the things he's trying to do work out, and maybe things he's not trying to do work out instead. So I think that Loki's an exception. You know, if you put Joker on the Justice League, then you have a lot of questions. But Thor has always wanted Loki to come back into the fold.
Right.
And most modern Loki stories, like all the stories with Loki as protagonist, are about that tension. And I think everybody has people in their, you know, friends and family, certainly, who are maybe mentally ill or addicts or just untrustworthy, where you love them and you see a version of this working out. So you keep the door open. I think Loki fits that category. I don't think he's your classic bad guy, joins the team, but he's still a villain. I think he's a guy where you kind of don't know what he's up to.
So how much of the story do you keep? I mean, this so far looks like it's a very close POV, and that you have him telling us, the reader, the story in the order he wants us to see it, but we are seeing it from like an over-the-shoulder perspective by and large.
Yeah, that's a smarter way of saying what I'm doing. Yes, that's you explaining back to me in an intelligent way what I've been doing kind of instinctively. But yeah, that's it exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, much appreciated.
So that's what critics are for. So then, that being the case, like, is that how? That's how you. I guess I was going to ask, like, is that how we're going to continue going? And I guess the answer is probably. I guess.
Yeah, that's my answer too. Is probably. I think that cool. I think that because you're dealing with a character who, if you haven't read issue 2, by the end, by the final page, it's clear that Loki's in a much bigger situation than he originally envisions, I think we're going to get to play with the rules of the Marvel Universe a little bit. So when you're dealing with a character who is a creature of story and kind of operates on the principles of mythos, you get to shake up the format a little in a way that I really like and haven't had this exact opportunity to do before. So we're trying to do a little bit of fourth wall breaking with things like Loki's Trickster's Tips that come out every issue, and playing with the idea that Loki has some degree of omniscient narration, but is still caught off guard by things. And obviously, as the writer, I have my own theories as to exactly what this, how Loki is able to narrate the story, and what he knows and doesn't know, and why. But for now, it feels like it's working. I think this is how I want to tell a story where you are supposed to empathize with the former bad guy. And in some ways, it's just very comic booky. You know, if you read a story about Peter Parker swinging around, he's just talking to himself.
Yes.
It's the same first person narration. So if you have first person narration from somebody who knows more than you do, it definitely brushes up against omniscient narrator.
But it's also interesting because you have a character where you're dealing with a kind of. I feel like the tone in fourth wall breaking that you're doing fits in really well with like the Al Ewing, Loki, Agent of Asgard particular tone. I think it's almost like this is the Loki flavor of fourth wall acknowledgement, and how it's thankfully very distinct from like the Deadpool fourth wall. It's distinct from the She-Hulk fourth wall, which too many people have forgotten.
Yeah, true.
It's its own flavor of fourth wall, and like it would be really bad if somebody made the Loki fourth wall the like Deadpool fourth wall, for example.
Yeah, I think that there are degrees. Deadpool is, Loki is up against the fourth wall, kind of whispering to you, and She-Hulk breaks the fourth wall, and Deadpool is shooting you through the fourth wall. That's the hierarchy that I came up with off the top of my head just now.
I think that's accurate. That's great. I know one of the reasons that some of my friends who aren't normal comics people are super excited to listen to this episode is because so many people are such a fan of your just writing, and as a humor writer, and as someone who's really good at the internet and funny. And I don't want to lose track of some of those questions as well. So like what is sort of the journey from writing comedy into writing comics for you?
I think it's really similar to other people who do both. I grew up reading comics, obviously, and always wanted to write comics. But when you are a writer starting out, you don't necessarily know what your career is going to be because there's so many people saying no that you have to put a lot of stuff out there at the same time. So I've always written comics, or at the very least, the proposals and pitches and mini comics with friends and stuff. While I was in film school, I went to Columbia College of Chicago, and I took a little bit of classes at Second City, and what I ended up doing was kind of falling into the Chicago stand-up scene via YouTube videos that I was making. Mm-hmm. So I would do video collaborations with friends, or if there was like a variety show. There's a great independent stand-up showcase in Chicago called the Lincoln Lodge, and they would have a variety slot. So sometimes you'd have like a band or a funny musician or something, and they would let me come up with a DVD player that worked, maybe an eighth of the time, and vamp while I tried to get the DVDs working, so I could show like short films that I had made. So I've always been writing comedy, and the comedy that I was doing was more kind of, short form narrative characters in the service of a story, or, like a gag that you have to ramp up to. Less stand-up, less improv. So I think that everything I've always done has been wanting to write funny stories. In the case of comic books, brooding stories, when people let me, or when I trick them into letting me. So I guess I sort of just pursued both concurrently, and then when I started to get comedy jobs, having credits on your resume helps you get the attention of publishers. And I had a friend who worked for Valiant who hired me to do some gag strips, and then kind of that led to meeting other people at Valiant, and that led to getting asked to pitch on Valiant High, which was going to be like a digital first. So it's very incremental progress. Doing a one-page gag strip in a Valiant comic, sort of leading to a digital exclusive Valiant miniseries, leading to getting to do like a very short Harley Quinn story in the 25th anniversary anthology. So I think I at the same time, thank you for saying I was good at the internet, which should probably just be my new Twitter bio. I guess I was just making friends in comedy, talking about comics constantly on the internet, and sort of in a very kind of incidental way becoming known as somebody who would write comic books for you if you liked what I was making and had an idea that we could collaborate on. So it was very, very slow, very incremental, but very organic, and I feel like it all kind of goes together in my mind.
Do you feel like writing comedy for the internet, especially in a short form like Twitter, is distinct than writing for late night, or are they more connected?
I think it depends on what you're doing. At the late show, we kind of all write everything. We don't have a lot of dedicated beats or anything. So certainly, if you're mad about politics and you have a snappy one-liner that you could put on Twitter, I might say that I have a responsibility to pitch that for my actual job, the show that I write on that allows me to pay my bills. But because of that, my Twitter especially, has become more and more kind of talking about comics or telling people to please check out my comics, or just like the things that are so half-formed that they can only exist on Twitter. Things that are these sort of like incredibly impulsive, stupid thoughts that I have to get out of my head, and that I appreciate that for some reason people follow me and allow them to enter their heads.
That's really interesting.
It's sort of a group. It's a very charitable kind of group therapy thing that people follow me on Twitter.
I mean, I don't. It's not charity. It's like you're providing us with the necessary entertainment to survive in our current climate.
Well, I appreciate that. For me, it is therapeutic to have something where there are no rules.
I mean, but I also think about like the particular format of like there's a photo and you're commenting on it. It's sort of like a modern version of the single panel comic. It's almost like meme. I mean, yesterday as I was getting ready to interview you, a friend of mine had reposted one of your tweets and had literally reposted it with the headline like, "This is some rose water to like de-stankify your timeline," and it was your post from July 24th, 2016, that has the picture of Mads Mikkelsen and Tilda Swinton looking super hot, and she's like just androgynous enough that like all folks are like, oh yeah, and then with the headline, "When you meet a European couple on vacation who wants to swing," and you're like, shit, maybe, like that's a particular format of humor. And it's interesting because it made me think about, like, I used to work at the Writers Guild East. A lot of the comedy writers for late night who I spoke to, they'd kind of come, who were a little older than our generation, had kind of come in from submitting gags to the late night shows. Like, people used to just, like, fax gags
Oh, yeah, sure.
to the late shows that would make an individual joke, I guess, of a unit of joke. And that's interesting because those, I think, were just sort of calling themselves into existence from nothingness almost. Whereas this sort of sort of meme, like, that's sort of a meme culture thing that you invented there.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I think that it's a very internet era joke when, it's things like my face when, or, that feeling when, you're springboarding off of something funny that you found. And obviously, like, a joke that's going to get told verbally, or that can be written down and sent via fax machine and has the full context it needs to survive. That's something where you have to write and provide your own setup. And I think that's really interesting. The difference between kind of fooling around on the internet and telling jokes for free, where you can kind of react to a thing, and then you have the technology to share that thing. Like you're all playing Mystery Science Theater together, but with the entire world.
Ooh, that's a great one.
Yeah, that's kind of how it feels to me. You're riffing on a thing that is happening. This reference will age terribly if somebody listens to the podcast a year from now. But the day where everybody was excited about the 30 to 50 feral hogs.
Oh, that day will not be forgotten.
I hope not. I hope it lives on in our own mythos. But that's something where you can kind of just say whatever because everybody's participating in the phenomenon together. Whereas if you're writing a late night joke, especially kind of a classic fax machine era late night joke, you have to say, President Clinton told reporters today that blah, 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 sounds to me like blah, 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 blah. and that's a joke where you have to provide the context about what's happening, kind of educate the listener so that your punchline works.
Right. Do you think that this kind of form of internet humor is like changing the way humor works in other formats, like in TV writing?
I don't know. I think a lot of the language is. You see things like commercials trying to be funny or sort of exist in an ironic space, or even a post-ironic space. I think that the internet becoming so ubiquitous and almost having its own vernacular is definitely seeping into more mainstream stuff. But I don't know that that's that different than slang. I'm not sure that that's that different than the way fads have always kind of had a life cycle where. My dad used to say if you heard Johnny Carson use a cool new slang word, you knew it was dead, because he was the guy. He was America's friendly, uncontroversial mainstream man. It's hard to say. I think almost certainly because it's a place that so many people are hanging out all of the time, but I think there was a weird Twitter is sort of now most of Twitter, but I don't know if most of Twitter is necessarily reflective of the world. So there's still probably a bubble. I think that extremely online people, as we call ourselves, are still probably not influencing mainstream culture with our thought patterns and language choices.
I mean, I think there's probably a lag time. I think it would be almost inconceivable to me for that not to eventually be something that is like shifting.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. It's not. We're not driving the car yet, but that day's coming.
Does that mean that like the average basic bro comedy movie is going to eventually be something I find funny in 10 to 20 years?
I think that's how it works. Yeah, I do. And I think that that's also just how brain chemistry works, is that you settle into this place where you have maybe softened a little bit as a person, and also maybe you have more purchasing power or political power now that you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s. I mean, a really good example, we went out to dinner at a pretty nice place to celebrate our anniversary, and they were playing Novocaine for the Soul by Eels, or the Eels. And nothing tells you that you're 35 like hearing the music you loved in high school and college in a expensive restaurant. Because, a few years before that, it would have been Frank Sinatra or something.
Yeah.
So
that is real.
That's a big flashing beacon that says you are an adult. You are currently participating in and driving mainstream culture. So since I am also of the internet, and apparently the music I like is what they're catering to people in restaurants with, I think you're probably right. I think that the way we talk to our friends is going to be the normal way of talking until revolutionary young people understandably put us in our place.
Well, it's also interesting because I was just thinking, where is it that I go to access humor? I see funny things in social media, although I'm not an addict to meme pages. My husband is kind of more from that culture than I am. I'm sort of in there so I can make topical stuff for political purposes to an extent. I'm like, what are the memes that I can then use to make them be about workers' rights to organize? But I'm more likely to see things that I think are funny on television than I am in a movie theater, for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think TV is a little more immediate and a little lower risk. It probably goes through less filters a lot of the time. But we react really big when there's a joke in a movie that reminds us of something from the internet or from maybe a more contemporary kind of cool comedy show like The Good Place or something. Like when a joke of that sort of sharpness and modernity gets into a movie, it sort of takes me aback for a second. I think you're right. I think I'm used to movies being 1 or 2 years behind how my friends and I are talking. I was a little bummed out when the new Spider-Man movie had a joke about throwing up in your mouth a little, because I felt like we all agreed that we'd moved on from that. That if you've heard somebody, and that was a rule I learned working for The Onion as well, that if 2 to 3 people come up with the same punchline, you probably want to dig a little deeper. That you might reject something on principle. If more than one person thinks of it at the same time, it might mean that there's something less superficial if you keep working.
And how is writing comedy for late night, which is not it's character driven in the sense that Colbert is a character, but it's not narrative driven in the same way as a comic book. Different from writing for comics, especially with you have the expanded visual ability of a comic where you can literally draw anything so long as it's not a dick, I guess.
Yeah, they tried that once. And we talked about it on Colbert. Yeah, the Batman Damned, I believe the title is called. Had in a previous...
Batman Black Label.
Yes,
I wasn't even being specific.
Yes. No, not at all.
But you're right.
Not at all. I was just latching onto an example that I'm particularly fond of.
That's great.
I'd say it's ultimately about the biggest difference, I think, is that in narrative, you're telling a story about a character, and the character should be relatable to the audience in some way. They want something, or they're very competent, which makes them attractive. Or they're the underdog, which at least in most Western audiences, that's the person you root for. And with comedy that's kind of for everybody, topical comedy, I think the protagonist is the audience. It's our continued shared well-being and the catharsis that comes from understanding something and hearing it retold in a way where you don't feel crazy. Things are bad. Things are definitely bad, but there are also people trying to gaslight you that it's not bad. And I think the one of the biggest functions of the Late Show is that we're turning things into jokes, but we're turning things into jokes so that you're not crazy. So I think it's really similar because it's a lot of storytelling and analogizing, and you're kind of using the host as a relatable person to tell you how you feel about things that are happening to you. Like, I don't have the words for this, but here's a show with a really funny, charismatic, actual genius at the center of it, and a writing and producing staff behind him, spending a whole day talking about, like, well, what is this? Like, what does this mean? You know, what is this when someone does this? What is it like in your life? And now that they're doing it writ large, you know, are they behaving like a kid at a birthday party? Are they behaving like a drunk stepdad? I'm not talking about any president in particular.
No.
But it's...
Hypothetically.
But it might be somebody who, you know, literally is a stepdad. It's tough. I think it's like an analogy I use a lot is like if you're watching somebody writing at a computer and you can't see the screen, you know, you don't necessarily know what they're writing. If you see somebody playing a video game and you can just see the controller in their hands, something like writing Loki might be like playing a big, you know, open world Zelda game where it's like, well, what does this character need and how is he going to get it? And I relates to him because it's, you know, third person and he looks like I feel like I am him in this world. And then writing something like The Late Show is like Mario Kart. It's like, we just got to get through it, man. We just got to go. Throw the bombs along the way. Throw the shells along the way. So well, it's nuanced, but ultimately it just comes down to, you know, two different kinds of storytelling, like different tools available to you in these two different kinds of storytelling.
Well, speaking of making Loki relatable, you or artists working on the books, such as Oscar Balzaldua and also Variant cover artist, the great Pabs Tar, have invented a new casual cosplay of Loki for the book, which is the T-shirt that says LOW space KEY, Loki.
Right.
And I saw that and I was like, are you aware that people are going to make that T-shirt at home and that it'll eventually be something that Marvel might sell? Like, how did you guys come up with that particular T-shirt gag? Like, were you thinking about that in terms of cosplay? Like, how did that kind of come together?
Yeah, no, 1,000,000%, all of the above. Because I buy those shirts. I'm the guy who goes to the gym in my "I'm Not Daredevil" shirt.
Right. Right.
And I have the purple one. That's a few years ago. Matt Fraction and Kelly Suda Comic did a fundraiser on We Love Fine, I think the website's called.
Yep.
For a anti-domestic violence charity, and I had to get that purple shirt that said Hawk Guy on it. So yeah, I think that the most fun thing about writing Loki is that everything is meta-narrative, right? Because he's the god of stories. So I 100% thought, hey, you know what would be funny? And you know what he would actually do in character is wear a funny T-shirt that would kind of call attention to him as a celebrity when he's going out in the city in his street clothes. And then also, obviously, it could be one of these T-shirts that I love, that people could make their own versions for cosplay outfits, and that conceivably could be in a store at some point. So yeah, we did that. We did that fully aware of what we were doing.
That's awesome and wise. I'm surprised more books don't lean into that. Are you guys going to get a cut if it happens?
Oh, I'm sure that's not how it works. But it will.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not either. But I always ask.
It will make me happy to see them. It will make me happy to see them out in the world, and especially the homemade ones. And people have started sending me similar ones, either sending me blank ones that they know that they can add the letters to, and somebody on Twitter sent me one that was the exact same cut and color scheme, but then in loopy gold glitter writing, it said "Living My Best Life," which they observed, and I agree, is also extremely Loki.
Yeah. Oh, that's really great. The other big fashion observation, Actually, just generally, there's a lot of interesting fashion. There's a lot of interesting fashion decisions that I feel like are really particular to this book, but really well substantiated by canon. And wondering if this is something that you and your penciler Oscar Bazaldua had like sort of worked on together, or kind of how those choices came to be.
Yeah, it's. I think it definitely originates for me. Most of the clothing choices are in the script, and that's just something that I love as a writer and as a comics fan. I think that we've been doing these stories for so long as a culture, and one of the things that keeps that is closer to the surface than ever is the human aspect of it. That they are people first and superheroes second in a lot of cases. So I'm a big sucker for things like Scott Pilgrim, where you get to see them in all their little outfits, and the storytelling that you can do by putting somebody in street clothes when it's logical to do so. And I loved the Chris Claremont and John Byrne X-Men. And also, a lot of other artists who were on the Claremont X-Men run, they would have, you get to see Wolverine in his jacket and his cowboy hats, and it's almost like a different, superhero costume in some ways, because it still kind of conveys something about them in that moment. So yeah, it was very important to me that we get to put Loki in a bunch of little outfits, because he's a confident person. He knows he looks great, and he knows he's doing a bit. He's in on the bit. In our Lockjaw series, we are ambushing D-Man, who is the sidekick, the secondary protagonist for our Lockjaw story, since Lockjaw can't talk. It was useful to have a human around who could kind of discover things and explain things. So I picked D-Man because he's had such a rough go of things, and he really seemed like somebody who needed to pet a dog. But D-Man D-Man's not in his superhero costume when he gets ambushed. He's down on his luck. He's depressed. He's on the couch. He's wearing a hoodie and his own wrestling merch, and like a pair of like lace-up boots, like kind of like Doc Martens boots that our artist Carlos Villa put him in. And I love that, because he's still dressed as a superhero. He still has the big D on his chest. But maybe it goes back to my love of AUs and like variant cosplays and things like that. But these are all still costumes. Like Loki's wearing green glasses, which I think is very superhero-y. He's just also wearing blue jeans.
Right. You've got the casual combination. And the way he's really aware of clothing, and like he's like in issue 2, minor spoiler, I guess.
Very minor spoiler. Do not fast forward.
When he's like talking with Tony Stark through his digital assistant screen, basically. He sort of comments like, "Oh, and now you're wearing a pencil skirt," because of the way his face comes in through the digital assistant and sort of takes over her body and her form. And I love that how like Loki is like, we're going to acknowledge this about fashion, and we're going to acknowledge this about gender, and like straight up talk about how like that's not how I do femme. And like Tony Stark is sort of like, we're not going to acknowledge that bodies exist.
Yeah.
And it was sort of an interesting character moment, I think, between the two of them. Although the whole issue is just, the 50% is like them in contrast to each other. But
yeah, I mean, certainly. And well, first of all, thank you for putting that so succinctly again. That's sort of how I see those characters. I think that Loki spends enough time in a female body that he is aware of his own prettiness in any form, and how he likes to accentuate it. And he's also just, he's a theatrical person. He's a very, I think there's a line in that same conversation where he says that people call him dramatic. I think that it makes a lot of sense that Loki would have carefully chosen outfits for the occasion. So, he can make an entrance and he can work a room. And it's a form of manipulation, which is ultimately his whole deal.
Yeah.
And then, but I love the way that you point out that the contrast to that is that Tony's not even thinking about it. Tony's just in the computer.
Yeah.
He has no qualms about the way that his hologram gets mashed up onto the female body. Because Tony's just pure information in that moment.
Totally. He probably was literally unaware of that until the moment that Loki pointed out that wasn't like the most obvious thing to have happen.
Right, and then maybe famous Playboy Tony Stark starts to feel a little self-conscious about it, which is also a fun thing to play with.
It is. It really is. If it hasn't come through in the interview yet, like I'm really enjoying this series a great deal. It's one of the Bane books that I'm really trying to keep up with in Marvel in terms of like when it's out, I'm going to check it out. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for making comics worth reading. I feel so stupid being like, where can our listeners find your work online? Which is usually how I end every episode. It's like, our listeners probably follow you online.
Yeah, I'm
but
around.
Humor me. Humor me.
Well, you can pick up Loki, and thank you for saying such kind things about it. I think our entire team is just like hitting it out of the park, and we've got these insane variant covers coming out, which is just like icing on the cake, because you go through so much work to make a comic book, and you're enormously proud of it, and you see the finished thing, and then the editors come out and say, also, here's a new variant cover by Jen Bartel or the one you mentioned.
You have a Jen Bartel cover coming out?
We do. I believe it's number 4. It's part of the wave of Mary Jane cover takeovers.
Oh.
Yeah, or the one you mentioned by Babs Tarr that kind of broke the internet a couple of days ago.
Yes.
So thank you so much for the kind words about it. And everything I do, you can find me at Kibblesmith.com. I actually update my websites, which is weird in 2019.
Yeah, it is.
And I'm at Kibblesmith across all social media. So you can follow me there, but it won't all make sense, unfortunately.
I mean, I feel like it does.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying.
Well, thank you again for joining us. And for folks who are new to Graphic Policy, graphicpolicy.com is a comics website. And we also cover comics adjacent and culture, movies, TV, video games. Graphic Policy Radio, we're on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever great podcasts are found. You can follow me, Ilana Levin, on Twitter as ELANA_Brooklyn. That's Ilana Brooklyn. I'm on Twitter a little bit too much. And I hope you'll join us for more episodes. We have upcoming coverage of the She-Ra Season 3. We're finally going to be covering Young Justice, also Season 3. And obviously more great interviews with comics artists and writers and the folks creating art that we love. So thanks for joining us. And like we say, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.